August 1973. A red-eye flight bound for Memphis. The cabin lights dimmed, engines droning steady. Witnesses recall a man in the aisle seat burying his face in trembling hands. What no one expected was that the passenger across from him, Elvis Presley, in his white jacket, catching the glow, would quietly rise to meet him. Stories like this remind us why legends live on. If you believe kindness leaves the deepest legacy, make sure you're subscribed, because these true moments of humanity deserve to be remembered. A stewardess noticed first the man's shoulders were shaking uncontrollably, as if he was trying to fold himself smaller in his seat. Passengers around him pretended not to see, eyes glued to magazines or the faint glow of their overhead lights, but the sound of muffled sobs carried anyway, even over the steady drone of the engines. It was August of 1973, somewhere high above the south, on a red-eye flight bound for Memphis. The cabin smelled faintly of burnt coffee and reheated bread rolls, a tired mix that clung to the recycled air. The lights were dimmed now, throwing rows of passengers into a sleepy half-dark. Most tried to rest. One man could not. In his hands was a small, bent photograph. The edges frayed from being thumbed too often, the glossy surface dull in the weak cabin light. Witnesses recall he pressed it to his forehead like a prayer, whispering words no one else could hear. His son had died only weeks earlier in a sudden accident, and here he was, trapped at 30,000 feet with his grief. No escape, no distraction. From 2 seats away, another passenger couldn't look away. Elvis Presley, white jacket, catching what little glow there was from the cabin lights, kept glancing over, at first, just quick looks, like anyone would when sensing another's distress. But the glances lingered, his brow furrowed, his breathing slowed. He seemed to recognize something in that father's trembling, something he couldn't ignore. The other passengers were in their own worlds, a businessman scribbling notes, a young couple trading whispers, a child shifting restlessly under a blanket. But for Elvis, the room had narrowed to a single man, a single moment. The stewardess, unsure whether to step in, hovered nearby. She later recalled how unusual it was to see Presley traveling so quietly. No entourage, no fanfare, just him, an overnight bag, and a kind of watchfulness she didn't expect. The man's sobs grew harsher, pulling even more attention. He tried to stifle them into his hands, shoulders jerking forward with each suppressed breath. A woman across the aisle reached for her husband's hand, eyes wet, as if the grief spilling out of that stranger was contagious. For a few minutes, Elvis stayed still, fingers tapping softly against his knee in rhythm with the hum of the engines. He seemed torn, the way someone does when debating whether to cross an invisible line. This wasn't his business, yet something in him said it had to be. Passengers would later swear the change was visible, like watching someone shift from thought to decision in an instant. Elvis sat taller, inhaled deeply, and his jaw tightened with resolve. He slid his hand across the armrest, unbuckled his seatbelt with a soft metallic click, and began to rise. The stewardess froze mid-step. The grieving man didn't look up, but rows around him suddenly leaned in, their feigned distractions forgotten. Elvis placed a steady hand on the top of the seat in front of him for balance, moving slowly, almost reverently, down the narrow aisle. The glow from the reading lamps caught the side of his face, highlighting eyes that seemed locked with purpose. The ordinary rhythm of a midnight flight, pages turning, cups clinking, engines humming, had shifted. Something else was about to happen, and it started with Elvis Presley standing in the aisle. every eye in reach, now following his next move. Then Elvis unbuckled his seatbelt. Elvis stood in the aisle, not a superstar, not the king, but a man moved by something he couldn't turn away from. The cabin around him hushed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the shuffle of magazines ceased. It was as if the air itself thickened, waiting. The grieving father still had his head bowed, knuckles white around that worn photograph. His shoulders trembled with each labored breath. He didn't notice Elvis at first, didn't notice the silence swelling through, the rose or the curious glances tracking Presley's every step. Elvis knelt slowly, lowering himself until his face was level with the man's. The airplane floor vibrated faintly with the steady engine thrum. His jacket brushed against the narrow aisle, catching the dim cabin light. The move was unthinkable. America's most famous performer kneeling on stained airplane carpet beside a stranger. Witnesses recall how he placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder. Not heavy, not performative, steady, grounding. The father flinched, startled, and lifted his eyes. For the first time, grief met recognition. "You're not alone tonight," Elvis said softly. His voice was low, calm, almost intimate. Passengers, close enough to hear, described it as firm yet tender, the way a brother might speak when words are failing but presence is everything. The man blinked hard, trying to process who was crouched in front of him. His lips parted, but no sound came. His throat worked against tears that wouldn't stop. Elvis didn't fill the silence. He just held his gaze dot around them. The cabin became church-like. A flight attendant paused mid-dial, clutching a tray of untouched coffee. A child turned in her seat, wide-eyed, sensing the weight of something bigger than her understanding. Couples clasped hands. Strangers leaned closer, suspended in disbelief. Elvis shifted slightly, adjusting his stance on the narrow floor, but never breaking eye contact. "I know that kind of hurt," he murmured. A pause, his thumb pressed lightly against the man's trembling shoulder. "You hold it, and it feels like it'll break you. But it won't, not tonight." The father shook his head, words stuck somewhere between grief and gratitude. The photo slipped from his hand, landing face up on his lap. Elvis noticed. He picked it up gently, his rings glinting under the cabin lights, and studied it. The image of a young boy smiling back was clear. "He looks like he loved music," Elvis said after a beat. The father managed a whisper. "He did." His voice cracked. Passengers closest described the moment as unbearable in its tenderness. A famous voice speaking into the raw wound of an ordinary man. The airplane, once filled with humdrum sounds of travel, had become a sanctuary. And then came the shift. Elvis looked at the photograph once more, then back into the father's reddened eyes. His breathing deepened, almost like a singer taking in air before the first note. He leaned closer. Witnesses later said they knew what was about to happen before the sound even left his mouth. It was instinct, a quiet, collective intake of breath that spread through the rows. A flight attendant, frozen a few feet away, covered her lips with one hand. Without asking, without permission, Elvis began to sing. It wasn't loud. Not the powerhouse volume that filled stadiums. This was softer, restrained, but clear enough to carry through the cabin. The timbre of his voice, warm, resonant, unmistakable, slipped into the silence like a thread stitching broken pieces together. The father gasped, covering his mouth, eyes flooding anew. A ripple went through the passengers. Some clasped their hands together, others bowed their heads. as if church had unexpectedly taken over at 30,000 feet. And all the while, Elvis remained kneeling, one hand steady on the man's shoulder, the other gently holding that small, bent photograph. The engines still droned. The lights still glowed. But inside that pressurized cabin, time seemed to stop. And then, without asking, Elvis began to sing. The first note cut through the cabin like a prayer. It was soft, almost a hum at first, but the tone was unmistakable. Even at a whisper, Elvis Presley's voice carried warmth, depth, and a kind of gravity that drew every ear toward him. "You'll never walk alone." The grieving father's head jerked up, eyes wide, stunned into stillness. The sound seemed impossible, as if a record had been dropped into the middle of the cabin. Yet this was no recording. It was Elvis, 3 feet away, pouring something personal into the pressurized air. Rows around them froze. A young girl peeked over her mother's armrest, her mouth falling open. A businessman set down his pen, his notepad slipping forgotten into his lap. A stewardess clutched the galley curtain, too moved to step forward. Elvis kept singing, low but steady, each word clear enough to float over the hum of the engines. "Hold your head up high." The father pressed both hands over his mouth, as if trying to dam the flood of sobs shaking through him. His shoulders trembled, but his eyes stayed locked on Elvis. Witnesses recalled that moment as almost unbearable, grief colliding with comfort in front of 200 strangers. Midway through the stanza, Elvis did something unexpected. He reached down, lifted the man's free hand, and held it, not loosely, not casually, firm, a grip that said, "I'm not letting go until you believe me." Passengers later swore the sound in the cabin shifted, not just his voice, but the collective air, charged with something they couldn't explain. People wiped at their eyes. Some tilted their heads, lips moving silently with the lyrics, drawn into the hymn they'd heard in church pews and funerals. Elvis's voice swelled, still not loud, but strong enough to reach every corner of the cabin. The pressurized walls seemed to trap the sound, amplifying its intimacy. And don't be afraid of the dark. A ripple of quiet sniffles spread row by row. A child leaned against her mother, whispering, "Is that really him?" Her mother just nodded, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. The father's face twisted with grief, then softened. Slowly, he lowered his hands. Tears streamed unchecked, but his gaze lifted, steadying on Elvis. For the first time on that flight, his breaths came deeper, slower, almost in rhythm with the song. When Elvis reached the final line of the stanza, walk on, with hope in your heart." He paused. The note hung, trembling with the vibration of the cabin. The father squeezed Elvis's hand, clutching it desperately, as if tethering himself to life through that contact. Elvis gave the smallest nod, a promise in silence. He finished the phrase, "And you'll never walk alone." Silence followed. Not awkward silence, sacred. A stillness so complete that even the engines seemed quieter for a moment. No one spoke, no one dared. Then softly, almost imperceptibly, another sound joined. A passenger 2 rows back whispered the line with him. Then another voice, shaky but strong, picked it up. Before long, a handful of passengers were murmuring the chorus, their voices weaving in behind Elvis's like a congregation rising in reluctant harmony. It wasn't a concert. It wasn't planned. It was grief turned communal. 200 strangers bound together by a song in a metal tube hurtling through the night sky. The grieving father, tears glistening under the cabin lights, finally drew in a full breath. He held Elvis's gaze, lips trembling, and for the first time, he whispered back a single word, "Thank you." Elvis squeezed his hand once more. His eyes glistened too, though he blinked quickly, grounding himself. Witnesses would later say that moment changed the energy of the entire flight. People who had been strangers now felt linked by something they couldn't explain. But what happened next wasn't in any concert program. Elvis reached into his carry-on and pulled out a simple white scarf. It wasn't flashy. No gold threads, no sequins, just soft cotton, slightly worn, faintly scented with cologne that smelled like cedarwood and something sweetly familiar, the sort of subtle scent that seemed to calm before it inspired. The cabin lights caught it briefly as he unfolded it, and for a split second, every eye seemed drawn to that small, unassuming gesture. Passengers held their breath. No one moved. The hum of the engines faded into near silence, replaced by the rustle of fabric and the subtle intake of collective breaths. The man's hands, still damp with tears, hesitated, trembling over the edges of the photograph he had been clutching. Elvis knelt lower now, steadying the scarf in both hands. His voice was soft, intimate, and entirely unassuming. "He's with you. Always." The words were more than comfort. They were a lifeline cast across grief, a tether from a stranger who was a king to a father drowning in sorrow. The man's fingers closed over the scarf, clutching it as if he could press every ounce of love and memory into the fibers, hoping somehow it could hold them there. Around them, the cabin had transformed. A flight once bustling with restless shuffling and muffled coughs had become reverent. Some passengers later confessed they were caught unawares by tears. A flight attendant, standing discreetly near the back, admitted she pressed her palms to her face to hide her own sobs. Unable to continue serving drinks, her voice trapped in a silent echo of the moment. Elvis didn't speak further. He simply stayed low, letting the father cradle the scarf. But his presence, calm and solid, filled the aisle with something heavier than any spotlight or applause could ever create. An unspoken promise, a shared humanity. Micro-moments multiplied. A glance exchanged between strangers, fingers brushing accidentally on the armrest, a child's soft sigh of awe. The father held the scarf close to his heart, lips moving in quiet prayer, or perhaps in whispered memories. The rustle of the photograph inside the scarf's folds sounded impossibly loud in that hushed environment, the paper cracking softly as if even it were reverent. Then, without warning, Elvis straightened. The soft crease of his knees met the cabin floor, his white jacket catching a halo from the dimmed overhead light. There was no fanfare, no flourish, just a man who had done what he felt was right. The father lifted his gaze, finally able to meet the singer's eyes without shame or fear. A single nod passed between them, no words necessary. Something unspoken, grief could be shared. Comfort could arrive in quiet, simple acts, and kindness could be immortal. The rest of the flight passed in a surreal calm. Passengers whispered quietly to one another, recounting the scene in astonished tones. Some pulled notebooks from briefcases, jotting down what they had witnessed. Others simply stared out the tiny windows, eyes glistening as the lights of distant cities reflected on the fuselage. Elvis returned to his seat, reclined, and settled into silence. Yet the atmosphere remained changed, heavier, gentler, humanized. Every movement seemed deliberate. The flick of his hand, the settling of his jacket, the soft blink of exhaustion and care in his eyes. And just as the man thought the encounter had reached its limit, a new thought tugged at him. this wouldn't end here. Somehow, he felt the story of this flight, of the scarf, the song, the gentle strength, would ripple far beyond the cabin walls, beyond the humming engines and the late-night air. Some passengers later recalled that they could still feel the warmth of the moment days later, as if it had left a mark in their bones. Others kept the mental image: Elvis kneeling in the aisle, offering not a performance, but a piece of himself, small and human, yet monumental. But the story didn't end when the plane touched down. A week later, the father opened his front door to find a package resting on the welcome mat. The box was plain, brown cardboard, taped neatly, the kind you'd expect from a small store or distant relative. But something about its weight and timing made his chest tighten. The grief he had carried like a shadow all week seemed to tense, then shift, as if anticipation itself had a pulse. Inside, cushioned in soft tissue paper, lay a guitar. Its wood gleamed warm under the soft afternoon sun, amber and honeyed like a memory preserved. Across the top, in flowing, unmistakable handwriting, a signature: Elvis Presley. The father's hands trembled. His fingers brushed the smooth strings, the polished frets, and then lingered on the inked name. A note tucked beside it simply read, "For your boy and for you. You'll always have a song to lean on." The words were as soft as the whisper Elvis had offered on the plane, yet carried the weight of something permanent. The father pressed the note to his lips, inhaling faint traces of cologne that seemed impossibly transported from that late-night flight. He held the guitar to his chest as if it were the embodiment of all he had lost and all he still had to cherish. The gift transformed the fleeting encounter into a lifetime of memory. Each string became a reminder, each chord a heartbeat echoing the kindness witnessed at 30,000 feet. That night, the father played softly in the empty living room, letting the guitar carry fragments of his son's laughter, fragments of his grief, and fragments of something larger: the quiet power of compassion. Stories of the flight spread, shared in hushed tones at coffee shops, recounted to friends and relatives. Passengers from that red-eye would tell the story for decades, each retelling capturing the same awe: how a man who ruled stages and arenas could kneel in an ordinary aisle, offer a scarf, and sing a prayer. How that presence rippled far beyond the cabin walls. The family kept the guitar displayed for years, not hidden but honored. Every visitor noticed it, the smooth finish catching. Sunlight like a quiet spotlight, the inked name a reminder that extraordinary acts do not always demand recognition. Some visitors confessed it inspired them to acts of their own, small kindnesses, gestures of empathy, proof that human connection can happen anywhere, even 30,000 feet above the ground. In the end, the story cemented a truth that some had always suspected but few had felt so keenly. The measure of a person isn't only in their fame, talent, or acclaim, but in the moments they choose to act with courage, tenderness, and generosity. Legacy isn't always recorded on stage or in headlines. Sometimes it's a scarf held tight, a song remembered, a guitar cradled as if it contains the world's understanding. And in this instance, a legend known for dazzling millions became unforgettable to one grieving father because he chose to simply be human, present, listening, acting. As for the father, he never forgot that week, that flight, or that gift. Each year, he would tell his children and later his grandchildren not just about the tragedy that had touched their family, but about the man who met sorrow with presence, song, and the gentlest promise: "He's with you always." The legacy of that night endured far beyond Memphis, far beyond any stage. It reminded the world that acts of quiet compassion carry echoes that last lifetimes. One small act can shift a heart. One voice, one gesture, can transform grief into something bearable, even beautiful. And for anyone listening today, the lesson is simple. Kindness, when given without expectation, never truly ends. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes true kindness can stop a room. And tell me in the comments, what's the greatest act of compassion you've ever witnessed?